Wonderful. Having said that, I would also like to share, as we do usually, that if you are not comfortable with your recording being shared, or if you're making a contribution that you would prefer not to have shared publicly, then please let us know and we'll make sure to just leave that out of the materials that we disseminate after the session. I would also briefly like to introduce to you the three facilitators who will be taking us through this session and who've been working, as I mentioned, also in our very first meeting, very hard for the last months, over 5-6 months, to put this program together. So I'll ask them to wave briefly in the screens. Our facilitator from Africa is Hilary, based in Harare, Zimbabwe. Then from Argentina, Latin America, we have Carla joining us. And then our facilitator from Middle East, North Africa region, based in Cairo, Egypt, is Abdel Maula. And they are all HIC members who've been curating this space and creating the content together with the support from the HIC team cross-regionally. And before I hand to Heather, who is one of our learning officers in the Middle East, North Africa region, I just also briefly like to introduce you to the theme of today. So session 2 last week, we explored land tenure patterns and related violations and conflicts. I was unfortunately not able to join you, but heard really about the very rich discussions and conversations that took place. And so linking on to that, today we're looking particularly at strategies and instruments to strengthen struggles. I'm really looking forward to the conversations, to the different speakers. And so without much further ado, I'd like to hand over to Heather, who will be linking us to the conversation that's been happening on Google Classroom and to the various inputs that you've shared over the week since our last session. Thanks very much, Heather.
Thank you, Yolanda. So as you all know, this is a project that includes an asynchronous space where you all have an opportunity to share your ideas and responses to questions that we put on the Google Classroom. So I will share Nadine is sharing the screen here of the Google Classroom. Our question from last week: given what you have heard during this co-learning space, do you have any experiences to share which show the differences or similarities with other regions? So we have one from, I'm going to say this name incorrectly.
Sorry for interrupt, but we cannot hear, sorry Heather, we cannot hear Spanish.
The Spanish seems to be coming through now. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Okay, so we have one from Yamina Yanaguya Aya, who shares that they have found many similarities and are surprised that in all regions, we have almost the same problems, and the difference is only a greater or lesser scale, and that different solutions are also being considered according to their context, not only territorial, but also social, cultural, and even religious. And shares that in their region, they're fighting for women to have greater facilities to own property. But in other regions, they're fighting just to have the right to own property due to the existing religious context or how that's being interpreted. We have an input from Andrew Mackey, who says that experiences shared from urban informal settlements in Kenya and South Africa that we heard about last time both resonated with realities on the ground here in Lagos and Port Harcourt in Nigeria. the major differences in the big picture context that shapes what opportunities there are to resist dispossession, but the underlying drivers are quite similar. And he also notes that the nature of the social contract and social mobilization in many places in Latin America seems quite different to what he experiences in Nigeria. We have an input from El Maloudi El Kabir from Morocco, who gives us a nice picture of what is happening in Morocco. And I encourage anyone to, if you just go to Google Translate, you can translate his entire contribution. I'll just highlight some points. So he shares on the idea of community land tenure, which is the target of the Moroccan state currently, and has led to the eradication of indigenous peoples from their lands, practiced for more than a century, and approximately 15 million hectares or 150,000 square kilometers have been taken, which is the property of 5,043 tribal communities and impacts close to 10 million rights holders. The state has established tailor-made laws that make it possible to legitimize its illegal act. And the Moroccan practice goes against UN human rights legislation, and he lays out some of these legislation in his contribution, and goes on to say that the rights of the indigenous Amazigh people to own and manage their lands and territories in a way that achieves justice and equality are being impacted. That the public authorities in Morocco seek to legitimize acts of expropriation. And that one way that we can address this is to improve our knowledge of UN human rights legislation and related to the rights of peoples to self-determination. So this was very similar, this practice quite similar to what Palestinians are facing, which we heard last week in the presentations. But I do encourage everyone to go and just copy that response and translate it to your own language in Google Translate, and you can see some of the rest of that contribution. We have a contribution from Rima Al-Zubi, who shares that there is no awareness of optimal investment in land where she is, or harmony with humanity. So it's not, land investment does not take into consideration the needs of people. Our facilitator, Hilary Jousse, says that he sees no difference in the habitat violations across the regions, which means that there are probably a common solution since there are so many similarities. So that's great, because that's one of the reasons that we're joining together today. If we can find the similarities between our issues, maybe we can come to a common solution here. And we have one more contribution from Sally Mururi from Kenya with Pamoja Trust, who shares that in Kenya, more focus is given to substantive land rights. So focus on title deeds as a tool to enjoy land rights and ownership. And shares that in the Kenyan Constitution, they do introduce the idea of occupiers in good faith. So people who occupy land, but don't necessarily have absolute rights to that land. But not much has been done to protect those people, who are mostly women and children, women and youth. And this is why we see evictions in recent times. and rarely does the state consider compensation or relocation for affected persons. And concludes that there is a need for countries to include the continuum of rights in laws for sustainable development. So I believe we do have about 5 minutes where we can share, we can hear from some of you if you have any brief contributions to share on your experience of what you've heard and your own experience, the similarities, the differences. We'll give you that opportunity now. So if anyone would like to share, just raise your hand. Hillary, please go ahead.
I think just to add on my contribution on the Google Classroom, I think there's also something which is very common in terms of the challenges being faced in terms of land rights, housing rights, and habitat rights violations. Constantly the same victims, which are women and children, who are mostly affected in all these cases where we see these violations. So just one a bit of an addition to my earlier contribution. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And yeah, so we did see that women and children are impacted in one of the other contributions, and that of course is a theme, a running theme of this this co-learning space, that we do know that women are in many cases more greatly impacted, and youth as well has been mentioned multiple times in previous comments. And so I'll just give one last call out to anyone who'd like to share.
Heather, and I saw Eileen Rivera put her hand up as well.
Great. Okay, Eileen, please go ahead.
Sí, gracias. Era más o menos en
Yes, thank you very much. I was pretty much resonating the same. I want to point out that through this co-learning spaces, we've been able to prove that across these regions, women are the ones that are mostly affected in discrimination and access to land, and also access to communal natural resources. And I would also like to add that I also believe that for this reason, women have come together strongly and have led in many cases these fights for land rights, which has been the case, for example, in Latin America with the movement of landless rural workers that we all are familiar with in Brazil, or in the Zapatista movement in Mexico, or the fight for water in Cochabamba. There are many examples in which women have had an essential role in fighting for land rights due to this discrimination that we can see throughout all the regions.
Wonderful, thank you. That's a really great contribution. I think instead of, or in addition to seeing women as more marginalized or more targeted, we also see that out of necessity, they really become leaders in many contexts, which is really important, because you can see the power of women who are not given their rights to really fight for those rights. I mean, you can see that across regions. Great, thank you for that. Okay, so now I'll pass on to our facilitator, Carla, who will introduce our first speaker, who will speak on the global perspective. So Carla.
Sí, gracias, Heather. Bueno,
thank you very much, Heather. Well, it is a pleasure to introduce our next speaker who will talk about the global perspective about the challenges that in this context they have for the assuring tenure and the effects. This is like a urban Brazilian architect and urban planner. She has earned her undergraduate degree in the University of Sao Paulo. She has been working a lot in Brazil, starting from the government of the Workers' Party. She is the architect of the University of Sao Paulo, as I mentioned. She has a PhD and a master's from the New York University Graduate of Schools of Arts and Science, and she is currently a professor at the Architecture and Urbanism College. So she's training a lot of new generations in this University of Sao Paulo. She was leader of planning of the Sao Paulo city. She was also National Secretary of Urban Programs of the Innovative Ministry of Cities during the presidency of Lula. And she has written several books, amongst we have Guerra de los Lugares, or The War of Places. And it is a pleasure to have you here with us, Raquel. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever you are. It's a pleasure, and I thank you so much for this opportunity to be here with you, addressing this topic, which I address widely when I was special rapporteur on the right to adequate housing for UN Human Rights Council between 2008 and 2014. And on this position and under this mandate, I had the opportunity of producing these guidelines, guiding principles on security of tenure for the urban poor, which are the base of my intervention today with you, and that is available in my website up to now, I hope. And also, because of the things that I'm presenting here, that also are based on this international experience as a special rapporteur in each threats and real evictions, especially collective evictions, were the rule of everyday violations of the human right to adequate housing, and trying to understand why and what is going on that, I was able to write the book Urban Warfare, which is now published in Spanish and English. So I hope you can access, because that are all the rationale behind the things that I'm pointing out today very briefly in order to respect our time. So just to open up with that, I think we should reflect on a context in which individual freehold, private, registered, private ownership became the one and only possibility, legal and juridical possibility, to access land everywhere in the planet. And that was imposed over any other sorts of land tenure and relationships between collectivities, communities, individuals, and the territories they occupy, being them more individual, familiar, communal, religious, and other layers of existing tenure rights. Just to be brief, all existing tenure rights were residualized in terms of the construction of the hegemony of individual private property, transaction in the market as a commodity. And that became even more acute when, more than a commodity, land and built space became financial assets for the international financial circuit, which is floating over the planet, seeking where to park. And for them, land, urban land, and built space became a preferable asset, a very important role in the process of appreciation of financial capital. This supply, this this excess of capital that is very concentrated in very few hands, and that uses and mobilizes territories not for life and for protecting life, but for building rent-seeking landscapes and not landscapes for life. So why I'm saying that? I'm saying that because our struggle for being homeowners, of being recognized as private owners, registered private owners of our land, is a trap. Is a trap in the sense that this is the type of tenure which have more connections and more relations with the use of territories, of land, of built space, of homes as financial assets, as rent-seeking landscapes, and are absolutely subject to the movements of capital in a context where we have increasingly more concentration of wealth in few hands that are able, because of their possibility and concentration of capital in their hands, to compete in order to put the hands on the lands and the homes of majorities. So what I'm saying, what I'm arguing here, and that I come to a much more proposition side of my talk, is that instead of trying to insert our complex, collective, multiple forms of tenure into one and single model of private property, we should struggle to strengthening our tenure rights and our tenure modes in their complexities, in their multiple forms. Because if in one side, every settlement, every popular territory, every self-built settlement today is under threat of eviction because our tenure and the tenure rights are not clear, are not complex, but are indeed discriminated against by laws, discriminated against by norms, because laws and norms are there in order to promote space as a financial asset and not to promote space as a place to live. But on other hand, yes, there is a threat of eviction, and especially hard for women, but also for non-white, for ethnic communities, for religious minorities, and other more vulnerable groups, and especially the poor in general. On the other hand, every space that is being occupied, really occupied, by these complex tenures that are really providing life and life conditions for the poor, is indeed a place which is protected from the financial process to go there. So it's a kind of place which is free from the free circulation of the land and built space in the market, exactly because the links are complex. With that, and I'm coming to the end of my intervention, I am arguing here for us to concentrate our struggles, not to convert our complex tenure forms into the one and single model, which is absolutely financial capital driven, but we should struggle in order to recognize the possibility of multiple forms of tenure. And here I bring into the table, just as examples of that, I'm talking about cooperative housing. I'm talking about communal ties. I'm talking about community land trusts. I'm talking about the combination of different things which made very complex and difficult for the land to circulate in the market, which is the condition, and this is very important, in order to make tenure safe for those who are there, despite their income, despite their capacity of raising money, and open spaces which are not tied to financialization. I think it's very important to take into account that in our discussion, because it's not just a question of assuring that the family there will not be evicted. But of course, this is very important. But at the same time, it's a question of a building alternative future in which land and home are human rights, and not lands and homes are not commodities and are not financial assets. And building an alternative future, in it we can have a multiplicity of tenure forms, a multiplicity of tenure arrangements, rather than submitting ourselves, our planning, our systems, our political economy of our territories to this one and only model that never provided for the majority's opportunities to live in peace and security. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I think that's so important for you to remind us of the structures behind how land tenure is thought of, that they are based in financialization and capitalism, and that for land tenure that works for the people, we absolutely need to think of alternative ways and really struggle to make sure that our needs and our voices are heard in these systems. Thank you so much for that. I'd like now to introduce our next speaker, who is my colleague at the Housing and Land Rights Network, which is a structure of Habitat International Coalition. He has been a legal researcher with HLRN and HIC for 6 years. He is based in the Cairo office and is also the regional coordinator for HIC Middle East and North Africa. So Ahmed Mansour will speak now about remedy and reparation in the context of land tenure. So Ahmed, if you're ready.
شكرا Heather.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you to the colleagues and the facilitators who allowed me the opportunity to provide this simple intervention about a very important topic, which is the reparations having to do mainly with the violations having to do with land and housing rights. And it is one of the main methods of dealing with all forms of violations. So whether with evictions, confiscation, or demolition and harming human ownership. I will present quickly, give an idea about reparation as a main principle. Allow me just to share my presentation. Can you see my presentation is clear?
Yes, Ahmed, we can see you. Some of the participants are asking whether you can have your video on. Is that possible?
للأسف ما عنديش كاميرا.
Unfortunately, I don't have a camera on my desktop.
Okay.
I
No problem.
apologize. Mainly, reparation is a principle that has been established for many years in the principles of international law, even before the establishment of the principles of international human rights law. We will see an example, as you see in the first Sorotsu factory case, which was a crisis between Germany and Poland, where Poland violated its international contracts with Germany, and it was supposed to bear the international responsibility in implementing the principles of reparation when it violated its Sorotsu factory contract. The International Court of Justice, as it is clear in the slide, I got the text. It's a principle of international law and doesn't even require a clear text about this principle. We consider it or take it into as an ipso facto. It is imposed when there is a violation on part of one state. The state should take the situation back to what it used to be before the violation or the breach that caused the harm to the other country. With the development of the international law and with the development of the human rights law, there was the reparation principle has become established for the victims of human rights violation and for them to call for remedies before national courts and in addition to international courts when their national system fails them. In the international law, recently, there is an opinion about the Palestine wall, which was affirmed to be against the law, against international law, and that Israel would bear the remedy and to take the situation to what it used to be before building of the wall. However, also with the development of the international human rights law, we will find that this principle of reparation is established in international treaties. I give an example of some of the treaties that addressed the reparation and remedy means for victims of violations of the rights mentioned in the treaties, including the ICCPR and ICERD, the CAT and the CRC, as well as the Hague Convention, the Geneva Conventions, the Protocol 1 and Article 91, which talks about the compensation resulting from the damage to ownership. Also in the Rome Statute of the ICC, Article 68, that talks about appropriate protective measures and security measures that contribute to establishing the reparation law to human rights violations victims. Also, in the soft law principles, we find also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It affirmed that every person has the right to a fair and effective remedy when they face violations to the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Also, the Declaration on the Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime also addresses in detail reparations for victims of human rights. There's also the principles having to do with the protective measures against executions, extralegal executions. There are also the basic principles and guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law. I will talk about them in detail in the following slides. What we are concerned with mainly with relation to reparation is that the Human Rights Council acknowledged that according to the principles of the international law, the serious violations of the human rights law or the humanitarian law call for reparations to the victims and an obligation, legal obligation to the states to remedy these damages and to change their internal laws and mechanisms, whether the legislative, executive, or the judicial, to provide means to enforce the principles of the reparation in favor of victims of human rights. We also should not forget the Human Rights Council decision with relation to forced evictions that resulted from the right to housing that affirmed that forced evictions constitute a serious violation, and this calls for us to address reparations, means of reparation with relation to violations of human rights, to adequate housing. As I explained previously, the main principles.
Ahmed, I'm sorry, you have 3 minutes left to wrap up your intervention. I'm very sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, أنا قربت أخلص تقريبا.
I'm almost finished, he says. The reparation principles consist of 5 main elements: restitution, restoration, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantee of non-repetition of the violations. Within the context of addressing the reparations principles, we find that there is a group of elements that address the importance of implementing or enforcing reparation, particularly with relation to the economic and social rights and the right to land, that addresses a multiple forms of abuses. And it also addresses the violations that happen in a systematic way where state institutions share in the violations. And it calls for strengthening the means of justice before the judiciary. There, it faces a number of challenges represented in the weak institutional capacity, the fractured social relations, and the lack of trust, as well as the inadequate financing. The right to an effective remedy. I would like to make a remark, a final remark, that there is a lack in addressing the issue of remedy and reparation on the level of international political forums, whether on the level of the Sustainable Development Goals, the new urban agenda, or the principles having to do with the FAO, particularly with relation to land tenure and land governance. There is a serious lack in addressing the issue of reparation with relation to the victims of investment, development, or any violations resulting from third parties to existing communities in other regions. I address this remark that there should be more effort in addressing the issue of reparation in international political forums. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Ahmed, con tu
Thank you
intervención.
very much, Ahmed, for your message that contributes with factors that address the same problem that we've been discussing. As I was saying, we were supposed to be joined by Nuri Martinez, Colombian representative of La Via Campesina. As people in Latin America know, this Sunday is seeing the happening something very important in the country, the elections in Colombia. Given these elections and the important role that leaders as Nuri have, she will be unable to join us. Colombia is experiencing a very difficult context because she's target of threats and persecution. She is the head of a collective movement, so I hope you understand. However, I have someone else that will talk about a global strategy started by La Via Campesina. Maria Silvia Manuel, I'm honored to introduce her. She is an Italian lawyer that has been defending human rights for many years now. She holds a master's degree by UNAMI in Latin American studies. She specializes in Latin American rights and she is the coordinator of HIC Latin America. Now we give the floor to Sylvia. Good afternoon. Good day. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Carla? Yes, we can hear you. Well, Raquel says she can hear you. Well, how about now? Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real shame that La Via Campesina is unable to join us. The idea behind our invitation was to telling the truth from inside of our movement, all the process that led to the construction of the human rights and rural rights for people working in rural areas. We had the opportunity from HIC working at different offices to provide support during certain discussions and debates related to this declaration pushed forward by La Via Campesina along with other allies such as CIA International. We also created a small publication with La Via Campesina before the declaration saw the light, which was a manual for judges to protect farmers' rights. We assumed the task to find different examples all across Latin America to protect something that would be eventually recognized in the declaration as farmer rights. Let me tell you that that declaration was created after 17 years of hard work by La Via Campesina and its allies, that after the boom of neoliberalism and all the problems resulting from that, particularly in rural areas, a decision was made so that all their demands should be articulated in a letter at first, and eventually this document would be sent to the United Nations to create this declaration. This work includes some similar aspects of a work we've done at HIC. At the same time, we were trying to recognize the right to the cities, and that's why we believe it was so inspiring for her to tell us how we managed to create it. After 17 years of collective work and advocacy in the United Nations to recognize the declaration, this was effectively completed in December the 17th, 2018 in New York with 217 votes in favor. The declaration protects the rights of all rural populations, including farmers, agricultural workers, and even indigenous peoples. It starts off with a definition of what we're trying to do, what the declaration is trying to convey concerning the concept of farmer. And it recognizes fundamental rights for the discussion that we are having right now, which is the right to land. As we know, this is a right that is not internationally recognized as widely as we would have it. After many years of work with the UN talking about land rights for land, the Declaration of Farmer Rights finally manages to shed some light on these rights to housing, to food, to land, and other references to seeds, such as sustainability. This declaration is extremely interesting. A few years later, La Via Campesina, I believe that after adopting this document, we're super happy about this declaration being adopted. But they also said that agricultural reforms would be required all across the globe. I just wanted to share with you this piece of information. This declaration can be found along with an explanation of the process at La Via Campesina's website. There's nothing else I can share with you. Hopefully my colleague has already shared some information about her presentation, and with that, we will be able to continue this conversation further. Thank you very much.
Heather, I see your hand.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for that presentation and that introduction. I just wanted to add that there is also a popular manual, an introductory booklet that was put together by La Via Campesina and FIAN, which I can share in the chat. It's almost like a graphic novel, so it's quite accessible and easy to read. It's available in English, Spanish, and French, and I can put those links in the chat. Just a simple introductory booklet to the UN Declaration. And next week, we will also have a speaker from FIAN who co-designed this booklet. And I believe he may also speak a little about the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, but just something a little non-technical that I'll put in the chat, and we'll also make sure that we put it on the Google Classroom for you.
Thank you, Heather. Abdel Maula, we have a moment now for comments and reactions and reflections, but can you facilitate for us?
Okay, thank you. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much to Raquel, Ahmed, and Sylvia for these three interesting and useful presentations. The floor is now open to anyone who would like to share during this open time for about 15 minutes. We have Desmond from HIC International. Go ahead.
Yeah. Good day, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Great. Yeah, I'm really impressed with the presentations today. And one of the key things that actually been disturbing me always on these issues of violation of land rights and housing. We understand that the issue of land rights and the violation, those who induce this process are the private sector, and is also induced by market forces. It's really difficult to get justice for those, the victims, because the international treaties and conventions and principles that have been cited by Ahmed, we know that the government, the state, do sign these treaties and conventions, but fail to demonstrate this at the national law. So it becomes difficult to enforce if you are being violated. The victim find it difficult to enforce. So what I'm asking, since we have experts here, what is the right way? Because these are voluntary conventions that states entered into. So without demonstrating this into the national laws, the victims find it difficult in enforcing. So what are the way out? Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا ديزموند.
Thank you very much, Desmond. We move to Joseph Shekla. Go ahead.
Thank you, Abdul Mawla. I just want to point out some learning points and also maybe answer what Desmond asked us. As you recall from the first meeting of this co-learning space on land, we discussed a human right to land as something, as land being a universal need for humans. Of course, we don't have that recognized in law yet, but what we have been seeing from the presentations, and particularly today, the law is evolving. So so international law recognizes forced eviction as a violation of secure tenure, which is an element of the human right to adequate housing. That also applies to land. We've heard that land tenure needs to be recognized as not just a financial or an economic function of land, but also the social function of land and the various kinds of tenure to be recognized. Then Ahmed showed that when there is a violation that is a gross violation like forced eviction, that the entitlements of reparations apply, and that's not just compensation. It's restitution, resettlement, return, rehabilitation, and then compensation for things that can't be restored, satisfaction and promises and guarantees of non-repetition. That's really, really important that we understand that when this law about reparations evolved, as Ahmed told us, it began between states, reparation between states, and only later became recognized as a right of victims, individual victims. Now we have the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, like we have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And those groups have a right to their land recognized in the declaration. That's not a universal right. It's not a human right. It's a right of a particular group. But when those rights are violated, the compensation, or that is the remedy, should be a whole package. And what we need to really make these things operative is to use them more. That's what we do in the advocacy. We still have a lot of ground to cover, but it's really important to know these norms, how land tenure has evolved, how reparation has evolved as a right, of victims and how we can apply it to our particular communities, but also as a universal human right. And that gives us a big task ahead of us.
شكرا جزيلا جوزيف على هذا التوضيح الهام.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for this important and deep clarification. Can our professor go ahead and open his mic? Al-Kabir.
وتحية للجميع.
ممكن تعرفنا بنفسك معلش كبير تعطي نبذة صغيرة.
Can you please give an idea about yourself, introduce yourself?
ربما تعرفت عليك في زمن
من قبل بكثير.
We have met before.
كثيرا في
I'm Kabir Maludi. I work a lot in the human rights field in general, and I'm also working on issues having to do with the indigenous people. Thank you. I would like to raise an important issue that was mentioned in the intervention of Mrs. Raquel Rolnick. It has to do with the making land a good. And this is a point of meeting between us. What the reasons for which we find in capitalism, imperialism, that would like to commodify all the resources, including land, including the social sectors of education and health. So this is the main problem. For me, I call for thinking of how we can face this collectively, to face this capitalist attack and imperialist attack on the issues of the people. Maybe in the coming gatherings, we may get the opportunity to discuss the issue and the mechanisms, the possible mechanisms to face this situation. Thank you.
ميلودي سعداء جدا بصراحة بوجودك معنا وبعرضك المتميز.
We are very happy, Mr. Maludi, with your presence with us and your interventions on the website and with the group. We thank you very much. Excuse me. Should we give the opportunity, if nobody else would like to make an intervention, we can give the opportunity to Raquel, followed by Ahmed, in commenting on the questions.
Adelante y con eso concluimos el espacio.
Go ahead, yes, and with that we will conclude.
اسلام كان عايز يعلق بشيء. لو في حد رفع ايده اسلام.
Somebody had their hand raised. Islam. Somebody has their hand raised. Can you hear me? Unfortunately, he can't hear me. Raquel, can you please answer some of the questions if we have time, followed by Ahmed, and if there are other people who would like to contribute, this would be very good. Go ahead, Raquel.
Sir, thank you very, very much for all the interventions and questions. The question that is placed by Desmond is the one. Yes, when I was rapporteur on the right to adequate housing for UN Human Rights Council, that became so clear for me that everything that is written in these treaties, in these covenants, it's not really enforced on the ground. On the ground, what we have is absolutely the urban warfare, the conflict over land. And for me, it's basically a conflict between using land as a for profitability or using land for living, for surviving. But having said that, I think that more and more I see those covenants, including all the discussions on reparations, not as something that you really, the countries go there and enforce, but also that is mobilized and used in everyday struggles of the communities as another tool, as another instrument in their struggles. And I give you an example, the zero eviction campaign in Brazil, a very important campaign that is done nationally with different communities, is using the whole structure of human rights and legal forms and legislation in order to build arguments in their fighting and struggles in the courts, but also in their fighting and struggles in the public debate. So I think that if we see those things like that, if we don't believe that we have to put all our energy in new legislation and that we will, like, the right to housing is in the Constitution, so everything is done. It's not. It's not. The right to housing can be in the Constitution of some countries, and even in this case, the only guarantee of having the right to housing and the right to land being implemented and enforced is mobilization, organization, struggle, and building political power. But at the same time, strengthening the ways and the mores and the tenure arrangements that the people are there, being that rental, being that squatting, being that communal ties, commons, and all that. Thank you.
راكيل، شكرا جزيلا على العرض الرائع وفي نفس الوقت التعليق
Thank you very much, Raquel, for the great presentation and the special comment. Ahmed Mansour, go ahead. Thank you, my colleague Abdel Maula. I just have one comment. I would like to affirm for the second time that despite although the serious violations are on the states to implement and enforce these principles, I also see that the United Nations programs should take into consideration and be keen on following the victims of development processes and the initiatives for urban development and building new cities, to take into consideration following up the victims of these plans as much as it takes into consideration the implementation of these initiatives and agendas having to do with development and urban development. I reaffirm that there is a serious lack in processes to follow up reparation and redress for the victims of development and investment in building cities and in urbanization. Thank you. Thank you very much.
أي تدخل تودي التعليق دي يا سيلفيا؟ إذا لم يكن لديكم أي تعليقات، هل في حد من المشاركين يود أن يرغب في تقديم
any intervention you would like to make, Sylvia? Any contribution or comment? Somebody has their hand raised. It's written Slum. If they have the opportunity to speak. Otherwise, if there is no other speaker or no other contributor, would you like to move to the following session? Any other comments? Any other speakers? Raquel, would you like to add anything? We still have 4 minutes, Ahmed.
Okay. أنا في رأيي طالما
I'm sorry, I have a question here, Aline Rivera, if I may.
Abdel Maula Aline Rivera has a question.
Sí, muchas gracias. Solo es una pregunta.
Yes, thank you very much. This is just a question for Raquel Rolnick. because in the previous session we had a discussion on the ways to protect access to land, especially for women. And the general conclusion was that oftentimes when you protect the collective property of land, which, as you mentioned, seems to be the most proper way to guarantee that the land does not become a commodity and that's not at the service of the market, so to speak. We have that very clear, but we're still very much concerned about the role of women in said collective protection of the land. So how can, through social protection of the land, can women have a special protection in that regard? Because we can still see that at global level, women are still unable to access, and whenever there are conflicts on land or in housing, women are always the ones who are always left behind, the ones that are mostly discriminated or evicted. So I don't know if you could give us some specific examples in which the collective property of land and the social function of property has allowed for women to emancipate and actually access to land.
معلش راكيل في ويليام
Thank you. William, in more than 1 minute, go ahead.
ويليام
Can I?
اوكي just minute راكيل just minute
Okay.
لا just minute فقط. ويليام هل على لديك اي تعليق يا ويليام؟ William, do you have any comment?
William, do you have any comments?
Okay, thank
So
I just have a question.
فقط.
After hearing everybody and noticing that today is Africa Day, so I have a question. Is this merely a political declaration, or has this declaration constituted tools in the framework to access to housing in the development of habitat? Is it really constituted tools to have a more feasible access to land for communities, or has it only been a declaration at an international level for the media, so to speak?
راكيل هيلاري ممكن اعتذر منك يا هيلاري لان الوقت بقى يعني معذرة هيلاري ممكن راكيل في دقيقة.
Raquel, in 1 minute, would you please reply to the questions? Go ahead. I apologize to you.
Yo voy a contestar en español.
I will answer in Spanish. So thank you very much to Aline for mentioning the feminist perspective. I think there's this whole new outlook on access to housing and to land for women from a feminine and feminist perspective. And in practice, I think there are very interesting examples of cooperations led by women, cooperations made up by women and organized by women's collectives that have been registered as women's collectives. And of course, there are experiences in Central America. Currently, there are some small ones, you can call them pilot experiences, but I think they bring in perspective that we need to move forward in this direction. And I think it is very important to have this perspective here. I think it all depends on the co-relationship of power and efforts within these collectives to be able to drive the idea that they can be registered on behalf of women's.
شكرا جزيلا. هنبدأ ننتقل إلى الجلسة الأخرى مع
Thank you very much. We will move to the next session with Mr. Ilham Al-Marghani from Egypt, who will speak to us. Mr. Ilhami is from Egypt. He is an economic researcher, works in the field of economic and administrative consultancy since 1979. He is a member of the Egyptian Association for Political Economy, Legislation and Statistics. He's also an economic expert and analyzes the budget of the state mainly. He has provided many trainings in this field to raise awareness in the field of economic and social rights. To be honest, he has tens of articles and books. It is difficult to enumerate them in this narrow frame. Mr. Elhami will speak to us about the strategies of advocacy in the field of land rights in Egypt and the Egyptian rural areas in particularly. Go ahead, Mr. Elhami Al-Marghani.
يعني يريد أن يتحدث مباشرة بدون استخدام البرزنتيشن الباوربوينت. إن كان متاح يا أستاذ إلهامي أوكي، ما كانش متاح.
He would like to speak directly without using the PowerPoint
وفي نفس الوقت
presentation.
بالضبط حوالي 14 دقيقة أو 13 دقيقة بالضبط يا أستاذ إلهامي.
And at the same time you have about 14 or 13 minutes exactly.
وشكرا لحضراتكم على
Thank you very much, my dear friend, Mr. Abdul
المناصرة وكسب التأييد
for allowing advocacy on issues of land and housing in
الحقيقة
Egypt.
إن حملات المناصرة
advocacy campaigns
في عديد من الحملات اللي
there are many campaigns that have to do with residential areas. There was the campaign to defend the residents of the Maspir Triangle and also the Warak
وحملة الدفاع عن جبانات مصر المملوكية ودي لا زالت مستمرة حتى الآن.
in the pyramids area and also the cemeteries of Mamluk period in Egypt. This is still ongoing. There's also the defense in the Hattaba in Citadel, and there's also the campaign to defend the Imbaba airport land as well as the 6th district in Nasr City. There are other campaigns having to do with agricultural land. The state policies have changed.
تعقيد وتحديد الملكية الزراعية.
And then when the agricultural ownership or tenure there was an excess limit was placed. The excess land was distributed to the farmers, but since the 80s and the 90s, there was going back on these policies, and these land reclamation land distributed to the farmers is being withdrawn from them. There is a new law ownership of agricultural land, and there were struggles in many of Egypt's villages with people dying in defense of the land, such as Nafisa al-Marakbi, who was martyred, a woman who died in Sarandu, a village, and other Egyptian villages where there were numerous campaigns addressing the defense of land. When we talk about the people's campaign in defense of the Imbaba airport land, Imbaba airport was a civil airport that was established at the end in the late 40s in the 20th century with an area of about 220 fidans, i.e. 924,000 square meters. In 2008, we started to think about investing the land within the Cairo 2020 development plan to develop the area to become more attractive to investors, and the area was given to the urban authority, urban communities authority. The people's campaign, the people committee campaign used a number of methods in advocacy in defense of the Imbaba land, the development, and this ownership was taken without there being a clear and declared plan on state about this land, and therefore the litigation was the method used one of the methods employed by the People's Campaign Defense of the Imbaba land, obliging the Egyptian government to provide detailed plans and maps of the Cairo 2020 project, which was developed after 2010 to become Cairo 2050 plans to grab through it many of the areas and the people's residence places to become investment and tourist areas where also towers are built. The committee issued a statement to acquaint people of the risks, also acquainted people with the defense. There were studies being prepared about the project and the use of the Unified Construction Law articles, which
وعدم تأثيره على الحيازة المستقرة.
of the residents,
كان في
and that it doesn't affect stable tenure. The committee's statements were being published, and the committee leaders were hosted on television, in addition to establishing
إلزام وزير الإسكان بنشر تفاصيل المشروع والخرائط التفصيلية، وتوقف المشروع مع انطلاق ثورة 25 يناير، ولكن ظلت اللجنة بتمارس نشاطها أمام حوالات
exert its efforts to prevent any efforts or attempts to revive the project. The committee succeeded in
ووسائل الإعلام المصرية وقيادات اللجنة كانوا ضيوف على عديد من البرامج الحوارية من 2008 و2010 و2012 وفيما بعد ذلك، وقدرت اللجنة الشعبية للدفاع عن أرض مطار إمبابة.
And afterwards, People's Committee in Defense of the Imbab land was able to win its battle and obtain a court ruling against the Minister of Housing and to stop the project to move the who were the original residents of the Imbaba land. This is one of the important experiences in Egypt in the field of defending land and residents. The other example is the campaign to defend the district in Nasr City. This is one of the Cairo neighborhoods that was planned in the 60s of the last century. The state built houses that were well planned. Their heights no more than 5 floors with parks surrounding the houses, well-planned streets, and therefore it would be difficult to describe this area as a random area because it is very well planned since the 60s. At one time, people from the different governorates of the Suez Canal lived there after leaving their cities due to the war. However, the whole area is eyed by investors and businessmen because land prices have become exaggerated there. The land meter exceeds 100,000 pounds there. The province or the governorate suddenly started inviting some of the residents. There's more than 3,500 families living in this area, and they started to invite them to negotiate the compensation the state will pay to the residents of Nasri City. What happened? a committee was formed immediately to defend the 6th district houses. They issued statements to including the threats. There was also pages on social media in solidarity with the residents of the 6th district in Nasr City and the risks of removing the buildings of the area that will impact thousands of families. Also, contact was made with the media, as well as being hosted in a number of television channels. The committee in defense of the 6th district was able, through the media, to go into direct negotiation with the administration of the neighborhood and to refute the arguments given in order to develop the area. The committee said that it was able, with the participation of the main residents, to develop and do maintenance that the residents would bear, and thus the evictions would be stopped and the development would take place in the presence of the residents. There are parliaments in parliament members
إزالة منطقة الحي السادس
the issue,
عدد من البرامج
and there were
التلفزيونية والأخبار
television programs and as news published in the different newspapers.
يعني أنا عايز أقول إن بالفعل
I want to say that indeed in the battles over land and housing.
Okay, شكرا. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
الحملات اللي نجحنا إننا نوقف الاعتداء على الأرض اكتسبنا منها خبرات بتفيدنا سواء في المعارك اللي ما زالت مستمرة أو في المعارك القادمة من أجل الدفاع عن الملكية والحقوق المستقرة في الأرض والسكن. وشكرا لحضراتكم وآسف إذا كنت أطلت. شكرا. في انتظار أسئلتكم.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hami, for that very insightful and quite contemptful presentation, which basically showed that land rights defenders risk their lives. Their work is very difficult and is very risky, and quite a lot of dangers we are experiencing. Talk of the Abahlali in South Africa, where one of the land rights defenders was murdered, assassinated in cold blood. Talk of all the issues also Mr. highlighted, where land rights defenders lost their lives due to defending the human right to land. So next, I would like to introduce Mr. Stanislas Kamangele,
Hillary,
in charge of programs. Yes.
Sorry, I just need to check. I think we're having some issues with the interpretation from Arabic. I just want to check that Mandy's connection is good.
Can you hear me?
The other interpreters are struggling to hear you, and I just want to make sure that we don't miss something in the next presentation.
Can you hear me now? But did they hear all of Mr. Ilhami's presentation?
The Arab to English, they struggled. They said the connection is breaking. So we're going to try again, but if there's any problems with the interpretation, just let us know. Okay, we can proceed. Hilary can introduce Stanislas now.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you, Nadine. I would like to introduce now Stanislas Kamangele, in charge of programs and communications at Ferapad, director of Radio Amani FM, which is a Ferapad project, assistant professor at the Faculty of Rights, Department of Private and Judicial Rights of the Espoir University of Congo, researcher and author of 2 books on the administration of justice in the DRC Congo and on public order and crime in the DRC, president of the Club of Listeners of Radio France International in Uvira, and the moderator of the network of clubs Uvira and Fizi. So Stan, the floor is yours. You can go ahead, please.
Ok, merci, cher Hilary. Bonsoir à tous les participants.
Thank you, Hilary. I want to thank everybody, all the participants that are joining us here today. I want to share my experience and that of several actors that are working. And I want to share also the Ferapad knowledge that we had for the Batwa and Bambuti, which are the women and girls from autochthonous peoples. And then I want to talk to you about the isolated areas. But before I start my presentation, I want to tell you about what we do for Batwa and Bambuti for the right to the land. And I think that I can take advantage to introduce to you what is the rationale for the creation of Ferapad. Ferapad means what moved to have this Ferapad creation, as we have been seeing today. We have seen that in Africa, there are many indigenous pygmy women or girls, but they are living in very terrible conditions. And normally we work in isolated rural areas in our associations, and there are so many comments around the myths or retrograde customs and traditions, and they can be combatants and they are hired to do war. So during so many conditions of war, pygmy girls and women are really maltreated by everyone. They are raped, they are forced into marriage, they are suffering so many violations. So all those girls and women that live there are motivated in order to
qui pourra aider la femme et la fille autochtone pygmée.
Of a community structure that can help indigenous women and girls to be able to speak out, to be able to do an advocacy for their dignity. So that's what we see in the isolated zones. You will see that women and girls have different problems, like the lack of independency and the lack of mechanisms to be able to have autonomy. So that's why Batwa and Bambuti women have problems to have access to the rights to land and to the tenure rights. So we see many dangers in this situation. So the activist Women for Peace and Development have gathered to establish a structure that outside the power, it is outside of power, and this structure needs to plan some solutions to the community problems like the land conflicts, but also conflicts linked to habitat, and especially those conflicts that endanger the indigenous peoples of the Batwa and the Bambuti, as well as other communities. So with this vision, with this sensitization, women who participate in the Ferapat organization have the mission to accompany women and girls who live in the rural zones of the eastern part of the country that has some customs and some traditions that are harmful, to be able to create a sustainable development and to have the emancipation and dignity of women. I said that Therapat has different fields of intervention. But well, I had divided the time for this presentation, and so that's what I let aside, because I just wanted to speak about this framework, about the tenure rights and the land rights. So Therapat is fighting to promote human rights in the rural zones. So we have different integration fields within the Therapat. We want to prohibit some customs that are against women's dignity, and we need to have the emancipation, socio-economical and psychological emancipation of women survivors, because women are surviving these customs that are against women's dignity. With these intervention subjects within Therapat, we want to promote gender's equity and equal treatment between men and women. Now, if we have understood this sector of Therapat, now I'd like to speak about the approach for our work. When speaking about tenure rights or rights to land for the peoples. Dear participants of the International Coalition for Habitat, I'd just like to tell you that to be able to recognize the rights to habitat and to land, we need to have the community's mobilization. We need the struggle to recognize these rights to habitat and to land. So that's why I wanted to share this experience. And you will understand that these actions within Therapat are fighting for women's rights within their efforts to integrate the Mambuti and Mutwa women in these efforts. Also, we have some efforts for the well-being.
I'm sorry, you have 2 minutes to wrap up your intervention. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, thank you. I was saying that we are working to accompany the indigenous communities, the Batwa and the Bambuti, for their well-being and to develop their communities. So it is within this accompaniment that we do within these communities. Our vision is to be able to point out the social inequalities within the region and to promote equity within the communities. We need to protect the rights of the communities, the rights to land and to have a good environment. We also want to promote to the efforts of the Batwa and Bambuti communities to have access to the land and to the habitat, and to be able to have food security and environmental security. So the advocacy actions need to be directed for these policies to be able to respect the dignity of the indigenous peoples, the Batwa and the Mambuti. So that's the work that we do in those very isolated zones and that are disconnected from the rest of the country. It's very difficult to be connected to those zones. We have many challenges that have been presented, and I would like to thank you.
Muchísimas gracias por la intervención.
Thank you very much, Stanislas, for your intervention that helped us wrap up our global perspective, this trip around the continents in the global south. Now we will open the floor for comments, questions, and reflections, and please feel free to make questions, to ask questions to our presenters so we can continue delving into our reflective process. Is there anyone that would like to say something? Go ahead, Abdelmaula.
Thank you, Carla. Thanks for the two presentations. To be honest, the two presentations are characterized as if they are living at the same time, the same violations, the same problems that these groups, these vulnerable, highly vulnerable groups are subjected to. I would like to point out that the presentation that my friend Mr. Elhami presented, some of these people who were evicted from the land had a ruling against them in the Warraq island. They had a ruling of sentence of 20 years in prison just because they demonstrated against losing their land. The Batwa and the Bambuti are close to the same vulnerable groups. Unfortunately, through this co-learning space, we need to plan campaigns to defend these groups one way or another in order to guarantee the non-repetition of this kind of violation. And therefore, the question posed to the two friends from the past two presentations, what are the mechanisms and the tools or instruments that we can use and benefit from in this kind of violations against vulnerable and impoverished groups? Thank you.
Hello. Hello.
Sí, adelante, Desmond.
Yes. Do I have
Go
the
ahead,
floor?
Desmond.
Great. The two presentations are also informative. And one point I want to make is the issue of land right and housing for women. It is really a very serious thing, particularly for Africa, that the issue of culture and religion is very strong in terms of land and housing right for women. But you discover that most of the time, the women are the ones that work so much for even acquiring the land and even the production of housing. But at the end of the day, they don't have a right to it. They don't have right to inheritance. And it becomes so difficult. So if we are designing advocacy strategy, we have to really target on how we are going to resolve the issue of culture and religion. As long as the issue of culture and religion is not solved, the land right and housing for women will still remain a big challenge. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Desmond.
Thank you very much, Desmond. Hillary, go ahead.
Hillary, ¿me escuchas?
Hillary, can you hear us? You raised your hand.
Okay, thank you so much, Carla. I just wanted to make a comment or just add also to the discussion, the issue of which was raised maybe earlier on in the beginning of the victims being women and children. And Heather actually highlighted also the issue of the youth, which I think is also a very key component in terms of us trying to advocate, trying to also promote and protect land rights, as they are maybe the active component of society, also the fabric of society. So I think we also have to look around, maybe creating a strong youth
I think we've lost Hillary.
Perdimos a Hillary, sí.
Yes, we lost Hillary. I would like to take this opportunity to share with you something. In Latin America, there is a backwards movement concerning women's rights in terms of access to land. But as mentioned earlier today, there are some experiences that link the conquer of these rights with the recovery of tenure, the appropriation of land as a common good through the development of cooperative mechanism and the increasing participation, just like Raquel Rolnick said, of organization and the fight for defense of and the struggle against the commoditization of land across all continents through the self-management structures. This has allowed us to conquer rights and gain a certain level of protagonism, not only for women, but for other types of communities. This is really important. We need to consider also the struggles of our indigenous people. For instance, the Mapuche communities that are related to the fight against the commoditization and the accentuation of capitalism that aims to transform soil and make it a commodity that is something that is life-threatening. I would kindly ask all participants to use the floor. I don't know if Sylvia or Ahmed would like to use the floor to complement or elaborate on any question that was asked. We have 10 minutes left. I'm sorry, Carla. I've had a lot of internet problems in this last bit of the session, so it comes and goes. In case there are any questions for me, I would be more than glad to answer it. But I don't know if the question that you just mentioned was something directly aimed at me that had to do with peasants' rights. Maybe it's not related to that. Maybe it's not for me, But if it's for me, I would kindly ask the person who asked it to clarify that that had something to do with the statement being a little bit of a piece of media, so to speak, or if it had any importance. I believe that was what he meant by peasants' rights. Well, Sylvia, I believe people are interested in learning more about the connection between these declarations, statements, and covenants eventually translate into regulatory instruments and obviously are enforced in the territories. Maybe you can share your experience with us in your experience, obviously. Well, for the Declaration of Peasants' Rights, in particular, I would like to say that this declaration is not that is not important. This declaration shed some light on a problem. And in addition, this declaration was approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations, just like the Declaration of Indigenous People Rights. It's equally important. We must say that these declarations are called top floor. They are not binding. By not binding, I mean that people or states that do not respect these declarations will not be sanctioned. However, it has the same category that the first declaration we created in 1948. The Human Rights Declaration had the same characteristics, the same features. Obviously, it had a lot of upheaval in the courts in different states to enforce these declarations, even when the states are not sanctioned after incurring a violation. I'm saying this just to avoid considering this declaration a media problem. I must confess that I ignore if this declaration has been translated into changes in the local regulations and laws. As I was saying earlier today, in 2019, I believe, La Via Campesina established the need to make reforms to the agricultural laws in response to this declaration. This is pivotal because we're seeing that we have a long road ahead in this struggle. Just like Raquel said, one declaration is not enough. But the bountiful part of this declaration has to do with the capability of a movement such as La Via Campesina being able to make an important statement, to have advocacy in local and state regulations and laws, the importance of our members and their struggles all across the globe, such as the tenants and landlords movement represented by Carla here today is making a lot of innovative proposals, both locally and federally. Let us talk about the effort made by HIC to have international recognition to the right to a city and that relationship between HIC effort with the letter drafted for the right to a city that we wanted to bring to the UN and make it a declaration that eventually failed. We can say that even though if we failed in this road, we managed to have a local and national recognition. For instance, in Ecuador, in their constitution, and locally in Mexico City. And additionally, this right is related intrinsically with the right to land, even though that some constitutions ignore the right to land as a right. Now, to answer to your question, Carla, unfortunately, I don't know to what extent the principles of this Declaration of Peasants' Rights have had an actual impact on national legal systems. Thank you very much, Sylvia. In Argentina, we currently have a draft law fostered by land workers that is related to La Via Campesina. And as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of struggles going on and are related to this contribution. In the chat, we have a comment about Nairobi and the gentrification processes. So Dan, if you're here, please use the microphone to elaborate on your comment. I don't know if you can hear me.
Parece que lo perdimos.
I think we lost them. So Stanislas has raised his hand, so Stanislas has the floor now.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a question. According to the experience that our colleagues have shared, I was wondering, how is it possible that a country like us can have access to those instruments? For example, to the chart of habitat or the different conventions. How can we use these resources? Thank you.
Dan, ¿quieres hablar? Veo que abriste el micrófono.
Dan, would you like to say something? Because I see you had your mic open.
Adelante, no te escuchamos.
Go ahead, we cannot hear you.
¿Alguna otra intervención?
Any other comment, question, or maybe a takeaway that we get from the question that we got from Stanislas?
Pienso que en nuestra próxima
I believe that in our next session, in connection to this question, we will continue having this discussion how we can come up with political advocacy actions that are effective. Any other interventions or comments concerning this these questions, Nadine?
I'm just wondering if our speakers, Alhemi or Stanislas, want to comment on the discussion so far. Otherwise, we can move to our closing. Alhemi, would you like to comment?
طب لو سمحت.
Yes. I wanted only to say, as Mr. Abdul Mawla said, that indeed the experiences having to do with our countries, particularly the two experiences that were presented from Africa, as well as the experiences from Latin America, demonstrate that land and housing problems are common, are similar, and that there is exaggerated violence in the face of campaigns and movements on parts of farmers or residents in defense of the rights of land and housing. In one of the cases in a village called Sarando in the governorate of Bahira, one of the female farmers was killed defending the land. 1,000 other farmers were detained who were facing the attack of the police on the village. Also, there was a village called Sirsu in Daqahliya governorate that there was also, they tried to disown or take away the ownership from farmers who had paid the value of the land, and many of them were arrested. All of us have the same concerns, and therefore the four current meetings are extremely important because we share experiences among our different countries and benefit in order to develop our movement in the coming period. I'm very happy and I thank all those who followed us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that final comment. It was a great session today. I want to thank all the speakers and participants who shared their comments and questions. And this was our third of 4 sessions. So our last session will be next week. It will not be on Wednesday as the other sessions have been. It will be on Monday, May 30th. So make sure you have that in your agenda. And that session, as mentioned, will be focused on starting to build a proposal for a multi-regional advocacy work plan. So I know Stanislaus asked the question, how can people in countries like his implement or work to have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants implemented? And I think this is something that we can start talking about next session and even have discussions in the Google Classroom. So if there are organizations here who have experience in asking their governments to implement this declaration, maybe you can share some of the advocacy strategies, and this is something that we can build going forward. So I'll just remind you of our next question that will be posted on the Google Classroom for you to answer. The question will be, what are the advocacy strategies that you can share from your regions that speak to remedy and reparations for land rights violations? So that's the question that will be posted, and you're free to answer that or to share anything about advocacy strategies that you have worked on. And I would also like to just remind you that we do have an evaluation form for your comments on the session that Nadine has posted in the chat. If you want to take a look, just to share your thoughts and comments, any feedback, it will help us improve in future sessions. And we very much value your comments on that. So again, I'd like to thank everyone. I'm not sure if there's any final comments from anyone else on the team. No? Okay, so with that, I think we can conclude today's session.
Donc, on peut terminer la séance d'aujourd'hui. S'il n'y a pas de commentaires ou de questions de votre part, merci.
So thank you to everyone.
Merci à tout le monde.
Thank you, everyone.
Shukram. Thank you. Thank you all. Merci. Merci à tout le monde. Merci.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Merci à tout le monde.
See you on Monday.
Hello and thank you.
Merci.
Bye.
Au revoir. Au revoir.
Gracias, merci. Thank you, shukran.
Can I just ask the
Thank
support team to stay behind, please? All the
Yes,
participants, please.